She had packed everything she owned into a single trunk, and it had taken her less than an hour. That was the part that stayed with her on the train. Not the goodbyes, which had been brief and practical, not the ticket she'd bought with the last of her savings, but the hour. 26 years of living in Guelph, Ontario, and it had taken her less than an hour to close up the whole of it and walk away. There had been a dress she loved once, pale green with buttons down the back, but she'd left it hanging in the wardrobe because it belonged to a version of herself she wasn't sure she could afford to carry west. The letter from Rupert Crane had said the ranch was called Stillwater. It sat 40 minutes outside a town called Dunvegan in the foothills of Alberta, and it ran cattle and had good water and a house with 3 rooms and a wood stove that drew well. The letter had been written in a careful hand, the words evenly spaced, and she had read it so many times she could have recited it in her sleep. She was not in love with Rupert Crane. She had met Rupert Crane. But he had written that he was a steady man, that he needed a steady woman, and that he would treat her fairly and not ask more of her than she was willing to give. She had said yes because steady and fair were more than she'd been given in the last 3 years, and because the alternative was staying in a house where her brother's wife had begun moving Cornelia's things into the smaller room without being asked. Cornelia Marsh had learned early that need was something you kept private. Her mother had taught her that, not with words but with example. The way she'd smiled at the neighbors while the roof leaked, the way she'd pressed her lips together when her husband's promises dissolved again into something thinner than air. Cornelia had inherited the smile and the pressed lips and very little else, and she had come to think of both as useful tools. The train pulled into Dunvegan at 2:30 on a Tuesday afternoon in late October. The sky was enormous, and the color of pewter, and the wind came off the mountains with a coldness that had opinions about it. There was a man on the platform. He was not what she had expected, though she could not have said precisely what she had expected. He was tall and lean and weather-worn, with dark hair and the kind of face that had spent considerable time squinting into the distance. He held his hat in both hands and looked at her the way a person looks at a problem they are trying to solve before it finishes explaining itself. "Miss Marsh," he said. "Yes," she said. He did not say anything else for a moment. Then, "I'm Lorne Hadley. I'm Rupert Crane's nearest neighbor, Rupert." He stopped, started again. "Rupert had a stroke 6 days ago. He died 4 days after that. I'm sorry. I didn't know how to reach you." The telegraph office tried. Cornelia stood very still on the platform with her single trunk and her good coat and the letter she had read until the creases were soft. "I see," she said. She did not say anything else because there was nothing else to say, and because the part of her that understood how to survive things was already at work, cataloging the situation with the detached efficiency of a woman who had been cataloging situations her whole life. She had $12. She had a trunk. She had a return ticket she could cash in, except that returning to Guelph meant returning to the smaller room, and her brother's wife's particular expression of patient tolerance, which had always felt like a door closing slowly on a finger. "There's a hotel in town," Lorne Hadley said. "Mrs. Pickett's. It's clean and reasonable." "I expect I'll need to speak with someone about Rupert's estate," Cornelia said. "There was an arrangement made. I'm not certain what the legal standing of it is now." He looked at her steadily. "I expect you will. Rupert had a lawyer in town, a man called Ferris. He's decent enough. Then I'll need to see Mr. Ferris first thing tomorrow." "I can take you," Lorne Hadley said. "I'm coming into town anyway." She did not thank him effusively. She said, "That would be practical," and he nodded as though practical was exactly what he had expected, and he picked up her trunk and carried it to a wagon without being asked, and she followed him because there was nowhere else to go. The hotel was indeed clean, and Mrs. Pickett was a small, watchful woman who showed Cornelia to a room on the 2nd floor with a window that looked out over the main street. She brought up hot water without being asked and left a plate of biscuits on the small table by the window. Cornelia ate them sitting on the edge of the bed in her coat because the room was slow to warm, and she looked at the street below and thought about the dress she had left behind, pale green with buttons down the back, and whether leaving it had been the right decision. She decided it had been. The dress belonged to a life with softer edges. Whatever came next would need something harder. Mr. Ferris had an office above the grain merchant's and a manner that reminded Cornelia of a schoolteacher who had seen too many disappointing term papers. He was sympathetic in a brisk, professional way, and he spread the documents across his desk with the air of a man explaining something unfortunate but uncomplicated. The ranch belonged to Rupert Crane's sister, who lived in Calgary and had no interest in ranching. The arrangement between Rupert and Cornelia had been written as a letter of intent, which Mr. Ferris explained was not a legal instrument in the way that mattered. There was no financial provision for her. Rupert had simply not gotten around to it, and now he was dead, and the sister, whose name was Maureen Beale, had sent a telegram instructing Mr. Ferris to begin the process of selling Stillwater as soon as practically possible. "So there is nothing," Cornelia said. "I'm sorry, Mr. Ferris said, and he genuinely appeared to be. If the marriage had taken place, or if he'd altered the will, the situation would be entirely different, but it didn't, and he didn't. No. Lorne Hadley was waiting outside. He had said he had errands, and she had expected him to be gone. But he was standing on the boardwalk looking at the mountains, with an expression she could not read. He turned when she came out, took one look at her face, and said nothing. He simply started walking toward the cafe on the next block, and after a moment she followed him, because the alternative was standing on the boardwalk in the cold, and Cornelia Marsh had never been a woman who stood on boardwalks in the cold when there was a chair available. He ordered coffee for both of them without asking, which under other circumstances she might have found presumptuous. Under these circumstances she was simply glad not to be required to make a decision. "Nothing," he said. It wasn't a question. "Nothing legally actionable," she said. He wrapped both hands around his mug and looked at the table for a moment. "What are you going to do?" "I'll cash in my return ticket and go home." She said it evenly, the way her mother had taught her to say difficult things, with the smile pressed underneath and the feeling somewhere further down where it couldn't inconvenience anyone. "What's home?" "Guelph. My brother's house." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then do you want to go back?" It was such a direct question that she looked up from her coffee. "It's not a matter of wanting," she said. "It's the only matter," he said. "Wanting is the thing that tells you which problems are worth solving." She studied him across the table. He had not looked away from her, and she understood suddenly that this was unusual in him. That most of the time he looked at horizons and at cattle and at machinery that needed attending, and that looking directly at people was something he did rarely and on purpose. "My brother's wife has begun moving my things into the smaller room," Cornelia said. She had not intended to say it. It came out simply, plainly, the way true things sometimes did when she was tired. He nodded slowly. "How small?" "Small enough that I cannot stand at the window and the wardrobe at the same time." Something moved across his face that might have been the beginning of a smile, except that it stopped before it got there, out of what appeared to be tact rather than the absence of humor. "There's a cabin on my property," he said. "It's been empty since my foreman left in August. It's small, but there's a stove and a water pump inside. It's solid." He paused. "I'm not offering charity. The cabin needs someone to stay in it through the winter, or the pipes will freeze, and I'll have a significant problem in spring. I have cattle work that only needs 2 good hands, and I have 2. But I run the books myself at night, and I'm behind by approximately 3 months because Numbers and I have always had a formal relationship." He paused again. "Can you do books?" "I kept accounts for a dry goods store for 4 years, Cornelia said. "Then there's wages for the books," he said. "Cabin at no charge in exchange for keeping the pipes from freezing. If that arrangement doesn't suit you, say so." She looked at him for a long time. He looked back. He did not try to persuade her further, or list the advantages, or make it easier for her to agree. He simply let the offer sit on the table between them like something solid and waited to see what she did with it. "It suits me," Cornelia said. The cabin was exactly as advertised. Small, solid, a stove that needed coaxing but drew well once it got going, a water pump above the sink that clanked for the first 30 seconds and then ran clear and cold. There was a window over the table that looked east, which meant she had the light in the mornings, and there was a hook beside the door for her coat, and the floor had been swept recently enough that she suspected Lorne Hadley had swept it himself before he brought her out, though she did not ask, and he did not say. The main house was a 5-minute walk across the yard. He left her with a lantern and firewood stacked beside the door and told her breakfast was at 6:30 if she wanted it, and supper at 6, and she was under no obligation for either. She came to breakfast the next morning because it was 6:30, and she was awake, and because she was 37 cents away from genuinely needing the arrangement to work. He made eggs without fuss and poured coffee with the efficiency of a man for whom breakfast was a mechanical requirement and not a social occasion. There was bread already sliced on the board. He put it all on the table and sat down across from her and opened a newspaper, which she found immensely restoring. She did not want to be spoken to warmly first thing in the morning. She wanted to be fed and left to exist quietly in the same room as another human being, and that was exactly what he seemed to want too. After the second morning, she stopped thinking of it as an arrangement and started thinking of it as a pattern, which was different. Patterns had weight to them. Patterns meant something was expected and reliable. The accounts were in a state that she could only describe as optimistic. He had been writing expenses on 3 different systems: a leather notebook, a stack of loose receipts held together with twine, and what appeared to be the backs of seed catalogs, and none of them spoke to the others. She spent the first week simply creating a single coherent record, going back to the beginning of the year, and at the end of it she put the finished ledger on the kitchen table and said, "You've been undercharging the Bryce operation for winter hay by about 12%. He looked at the ledger, then at her. "How long has that been going on?" "At least 2 years based on what's here." He picked up the ledger and read the page she'd marked, put it down, picked up his coffee. "I'll talk to Bryce. Do you want me to calculate what they owe?" "Yes," he said. He looked at her again, the way he had on the platform, direct, with the sense of a problem being solved. "Thank you, Miss Marsh Cornelia," she said, because she'd been writing numbers for him in his kitchen for a week, and Miss Marsh felt like the wrong size for it. He nodded. "Lorne," he said. She had expected the loneliness to be its own problem. She had been lonely in Guelph in a particular way. The loneliness of being present but not needed, of being in rooms where the shape of you didn't fit and everyone was too polite to say so. Here the loneliness was different. It was more like solitude. She was alone, and she was needed, and those turned out to be entirely different things. She walked the property in the evenings because the light in Alberta in November did something to the sky that she had no good words for. It wasn't dramatic in the way of sunsets in paintings. It was more quiet than that, the color draining slowly out of everything, and the mountains going dark against a sky that faded from pale gold to gray to a deep cold blue that sat in the chest like a note held too long. She had grown up in a place of trees and smaller skies, and she was not prepared for the openness of it, for the sense that you were simply here, in the middle of something vast and indifferent and not unkind. Lorne sometimes walked in the evenings too, and sometimes their paths crossed in the way that things cross on a working ranch. And sometimes they walked the same direction for 10 minutes without talking, which she came to understand was a form of companionship for him, and not an awkwardness to be filled. The trouble began in November, 3 weeks after she arrived. His neighbor to the south was a man named Thorpe, Grant Thorpe, who ran a larger operation and had been interested in Stillwater since before Rupert Crane's death, and had, apparently, been interested in Lorne's water rights since before that. He came to the property on a Thursday afternoon with a man from a Calgary land firm and a folder of documents, and he stood in Lorne's kitchen and made a speech about consolidation and mutual benefit and the future of Alberta agriculture, and Lorne stood across the kitchen with his arms folded and a particular stillness about him that Cornelia had learned to recognize as the stillness of a man who was making himself say nothing until he was certain of what he wanted to say. She had come in from the cabin to return the ledger, and she stood in the doorway, and Thorpe turned and looked at her with the evaluating expression of a man deciding what category a thing belongs to. "I don't believe I know your situation here," he said. "She manages the books," Lorne said. His voice was even. "Ha," Thorpe smiled. It was a social smile, the kind that comes from a drawer. "Well, perhaps Miss Marsh," Cornelia said, "perhaps Miss Marsh might leave us to the business at hand." "She stays," Lorne said. It was not said loudly or with any particular emphasis. It was simply stated, the way he stated things that were not open for further discussion, and the lawyer from Calgary wrote something on his paper, and Thorpe's social smile went through a small adjustment. She stayed. She listened. She looked at the documents when Lorne passed them to her without explanation, and found 3 clauses that were written in a language that appeared straightforward, and was not a language she recognized from 4 years of reading supply contracts for the dry goods store. Language that gives with one hand and takes with the other. Language that means something different in the third paragraph than it appeared to mean in the first. She put her finger on the first clause and looked at Lorne. He read it. He read the third paragraph. Something in his expression settled in a way that suggested he had already suspected and was now certain. "I'll need this reviewed by my own lawyer," he said to the man from the Calgary firm. Thorpe said he understood completely, and said it in a way that suggested he understood. Lorne had found the problem and was recalculating. He and the firm man left with their folder, and Lorne stood at the kitchen window and watched the truck go down the lane to the road. "Third paragraph," he said, not turning around. "And the easement clause," Cornelia said. "If he gets the easement, your east pasture water access becomes conditional on his approval." "Yes." He turned from the window. "Yes, I saw that." He looked at her with that direct problem-solving look. "You've read land contracts, supply contracts. The principle is the same." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll call Ferris tomorrow." "Mr. Ferris seemed competent," she said. "He is." He looked at the table where the documents had been. "Thank you, Cornelia." She noticed that he used her name without appearing to decide to. It came out naturally, the way names do when a person has stopped thinking of you as a category and started thinking of you as a specific thing. Grant Thorpe came back twice more in November, each time with adjustments to the documents that were presented as concessions and were not quite. Each time, Cornelia read what Ferris sent back, and each time there was something in the language that needed finding, and each time she found it and showed Lorne, and he read it the way he read everything, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion, and passed it to Ferris. In December, Thorpe came alone, without the lawyer, and stood in the yard and spoke to Lorne in a register that was lower and more direct than his previous visits, a register that suggested the social performance had been set aside. Cornelia was at the cabin window, and she could not hear what was said, but she watched Lorne's posture, and she had been watching it long enough now to read it the way she read a ledger, for what was present and what was notably absent. He came to the cabin after Thorpe left. He knocked, which he had not done before. He had always stood in the yard and called her name, and she'd come to the door. She opened it, and he stood on the step with his hat in his hands, and an expression that was not quite uncertainty. She didn't think uncertainty was something he visited often, but was in the neighborhood. "He made an offer for this property instead," Lorne said. "Mine, not Stillwater," said the same consolidation argument applies. "What did you say?" "I said no." Was he convinced? Lorne's mouth pulled slightly at one side. "Not particularly. Then he'll try something else. That's my reading." She stepped back from the door. He came in and sat at the small table by the east window, and she poured 2 cups of coffee from the pot she kept on the back of the stove and put one in front of him. He turned the cup in his hands for a moment. "He said something else," Lorne said. She waited. "He said the arrangement here was unusual." He paused. "A woman living on the property, managing the books. He suggested it would be. He said people talk." Cornelia sat down across from him. "Do they? In a town the size of Dunvegan, yes." He looked at her directly. "I want you to know I don't take that concern seriously in the way he meant it. What you do and what your life looks like are your business." "But," she said, "but if he decides to pursue the water rights through the county process instead of a private sale, he'll use anything available to complicate my standing in the community. That's the next move." He looked at his coffee. "I'm telling you so you know what the situation is. I'm not asking you to change anything." Cornelia looked at the east window, where the yard was white with frost, and the mountains beyond were dark against a sky that hadn't yet decided what color it wanted to be. She thought about the smaller room in Guelph. She thought about the trunk she had packed in less than an hour. She thought about the green dress she had left behind, and about the fact that she had been in this cabin for 6 weeks, and had not once thought about the woman she had been in Guelph. Not because she had forgotten her, but because that woman had been surviving, and this one was something more than that. "There is a simpler solution to the situation Thorpe is trying to create," she said. She looked at Lorne. He looked back. "Yes," he said. "I'm not suggesting it as a romantic matter," she said, because she was a precise woman and precision seemed important. "I'm suggesting it as a practical one. The arrangement we have now works. It has worked for 6 weeks, and I see no reason it would stop working." "Nor do I," he said. "If the arrangement were formalized," she said carefully, "it would remove the tool Thorpe is trying to use. It would also, from a legal standpoint, affect the water rights question considerably. It would, Lorne said. He was quiet for a moment. I want to be clear about something. She waited. I'm not a man who does things halfway, he said. If I'm asking you to marry me, I'm asking you to marry me. Not as a legal instrument, as a fact. He paused. I don't know you well enough yet to tell you I love you and mean it the way that word ought to mean something. But I know you're the kind of person who finds the third paragraph, and I know you walk in the evenings and you don't need to fill the silence, and I know you ate biscuits alone in your coat the first night at Mrs. Pickett's, and you didn't call it anything except practical. He paused again. I think those things matter more than I can say precisely. Cornelia looked at him across the small table in the small cabin with the east window and the stove that clanked for the first 30 seconds, and then ran true. She thought about what he had said, and then she thought about what she knew about him, which was different from knowing him the way you know someone after years, but was not nothing. She knew he swept the cabin before she arrived without saying so. She knew he ordered coffee for 2 without asking, because he had been paying attention. She knew he said she stays without raising his voice. She knew he had told her about Thorpe's comments not to manage her, but because he thought she deserved to know what the situation was. She had come to Alberta for a steady man who would treat her fairly and not ask more of her than she was willing to give. She had found something adjacent to that and something better, and the difference between the two was exactly the kind of difference that only becomes clear once you are standing inside it. I think you've said it precisely enough, Cornelia said. They were married on the 15th of December at the courthouse in Dunvegan with Mr. Ferris and Mrs. Pickett as witnesses. Mrs. Pickett cried a little, which surprised Cornelia, and then she thought that Mrs. Pickett had probably watched a great many people arrive at her hotel in reduced circumstances, and very few of them left by this particular door. The paperwork regarding the water rights was filed the following week. Grant Thorpe made one further inquiry through his lawyer and received a response from Ferris that was, according to Lorne, brief and unambiguous. Thorpe did not come back. The winter was long in the way Alberta winters are long. Not brutally, but honestly, without apology, with a steadiness that required you to meet it on its own terms. Cornelia learned the property the way she had learned the accounts, methodically, beginning at the beginning. She learned which fence lines ran true and which had been patched with optimism. She learned that the horses had opinions, and that Lorne's opinion of the horses' opinions was complicated by genuine affection. She learned that he woke at 5 and was in the barn by 1:30, and that he came in for coffee at 8 and would read for 20 minutes if she did not interrupt him, and that the 20 minutes was not him being unavailable, but him being the kind of person who needed 20 minutes of quiet to be fully present for the rest of the day. She had never lived with another person who needed quiet in order to be present. She had always been told by the people around her that needing quiet was a deficiency of some kind, a coldness, an absence of the proper warmth. She had believed them in the way you believe things when you are told them often enough, even when some interior part of you knows the telling is wrong. She stopped believing it somewhere in January. There was a day in January when they were both in the kitchen after supper, and the wind was doing something serious outside, and the stove was working hard, and Lorne was reading, and she was at the table with the quarterly accounts, and she looked up at some point, because the lamp was flickering slightly, and she looked at him, at the way he held the book, at the particular quality of his attention, and she felt something she did not immediately have a word for. She thought about it for a while, working her pen across the columns, and she decided the word was home, except that word had always carried a geography for her before, a specific place, a specific set of walls. This was different. This was not a place. It was a quality of being somewhere, and she thought that she had not had it before, and she had it now, and that it had arrived without announcement and made itself at home in her chest, somewhere between the third paragraph and the coffee cups and the quiet 20 minutes and the word she stays. She did not say any of this out loud. She went back to the quarterly accounts, but sometime later, she couldn't have said exactly when. He put his book down and looked at her across the kitchen, and she looked up and he said, "You're staying." It was not a question, and it was not entirely about Dunvegan. She understood that. "Yes," she said. "I'm staying." He nodded once. The way he nodded, when something had been decided that he had already suspected, and he picked his book back up, and she went back to the accounts, and the wind worked at the windows, and the stove worked at the cold, and outside the mountains stood in their patient, enormous dark, and inside there were 2 cups on the counter from the morning, and a ledger that was finally, fully caught up. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, without either of them making a ceremony of it, Cornelia Marsh had become exactly as necessary to this place as the water that ran beneath it. And that, she thought, was sufficient. And then she thought, no, it was more than sufficient. It was the thing she had not known to ask for. And she let that be true, quietly, in the way she had learned from him, without announcing it, without requiring it to explain itself, simply letting it take up the space it had already earned.